1970, September 12th, 2008. Vietnam and Los Angeles, California. In 1968 and 1970, the United States was well within the jungles of Vietnam. During this time period, the United States was desperate for anything to help shift the tide of war in their favor. Because of this, they would stoop to a belief in the paranormal to help dissuade the Viet Cong to put down arms. Today we explore the United States' venture into a successful, or supposedly successful, Psyop campaign, one in which many people do not know about and very well could have shaped modern-day Psyop campaigns when the U.S. Army would conduct Operation Wandering Soul. And, in 2008, a massive train disaster in Los Angeles would injure over 100 and kill 25. However, the biggest mystery to come from this accident was not the accident itself, but rather a series of phone calls made by Charles Peck shortly after the accident. Charles Peck would make over 35 phone calls with nothing but static coming from his end of the line when his loved ones and friends would answer the phone. The only problem with this was that Charles Peck was already dead. Today on Unblurring the Unknown, we explore a government operation that was set in motion to manipulate the Viet Cong's belief in the paranormal and perhaps evidence of communication from beyond the grave. Today, we investigate Operation Wandering Soul in the Charles Peck Phone Calls. Welcome back to Unblurring the Unknown. As always, I am your host, Dominic, and if you are listening to this show on Spotify or YouTube, wherever you found me, first I want to thank you for checking out my content. I greatly appreciate it. Feel free, while you're also listening to this show, to feel free to follow me on my other socials as well, at TikTok at Unblurring the Unknown, and Instagram at the same handle as well. Now, that being said, just to get it out of the way, if I am a little bit stuffy today, I do apologize about that. So if it sounds a little kind of, I guess, phlegmy is the right word, in the mic today, I do apologize about that. Now, today on the show, we have another two-topic episode, and both of the topics today have kind of something to do with the paranormal, however, both in very separate and distinct ways from each other. Now, while Operation Wandering Soul might not be this grand unsolved mystery like we often cover on this show, it is a very fascinating story of perhaps an early example of psychological warfare and how it is quite possibly has changed the way psyops are done today. And then we also have the case of Charles Peck, who, much like the case of the Jack Frosse emails that we covered in an episode a very long time ago, could perhaps be a genuine case of someone trying to contact their loved ones from beyond the grave. Two very different, compelling, and spooky cases today on the show, and I wanted to package them together for this week's episode. But with that being said, and that's out of the way, let's start with Operation Wandering Soul. Now, Operation Wandering Soul takes place during the Vietnam War, and I believe everyone knows what the Vietnam War was. Just in a little summary, you had the United States inserting themselves into a civil war between North and South Vietnam, where the North was supported by the communist powers of Russia, aka the Soviet Union at the time, and China. The United States being the fighting force behind anti-communism during this time, and especially during the Cold War, which also started to ramp up around this time period of the 1970s. Now, the Vietnam War itself was controversial, mostly because of many's desires to not even go to Vietnam in the first place. You had massive demonstrations in the United States protesting the involvement within the war itself. The United States' seemingly only reason for getting involved was to help prevent the spread of communism. Many American service members lost their lives in Vietnam, and even many more were affected by Agent Orange and other chemicals used in the chemical warfare runs that were conducted in the jungles during the war. While the Vietnam War is a very controversial thing, perhaps one of the strangest things to come out of the Vietnam War was Operation Wandering Soul. Now, again, Vietnam was an uncertain area to the United States. Sure, the US just had fought in Korea in the 50s, but this was deep jungle and unfamiliar territory. The Viet Cong used tactics like tunnels, hidden trap rooms, foxholes. They dig kind of traps that American servicemen and women would fall into and get captured and die. This was very untraditional to the United States and to the Americans. They were unfamiliar with the terrain, they were unfamiliar with the environment, and to top it all off, these areas were very remote, they were hidden, they were cut off from large cities, and most of these conflicts took place within these thick jungles. And the United States was thoroughly out of their element. They needed any extra assistance they could get, so they would resort to, of course, the chemical warfare I just mentioned, but they would also resort to cloud seeding, which I actually covered in a previous episode over weather weapons, where the United States would seed the clouds above Vietnam to try and unleash torrential downpours on the mountain villages that would trade supplies between different Viet Cong camps, and they would also start to dabble in Psyop campaigns. Now, this is, of course, where Operation Wandering Soul would take place, and like I just mentioned, the United States was looking for anything that could give them a leg up on the competition because of how unfamiliar this terrain was. This wasn't an orthodox fight that they were used to. Now, I could not find the exact start time of when Operation Wandering Soul would conceptualize. However, the project would be developed by the 6th Psyop Battalion of the U.S. Army in conjunction with the Navy. The goal of the project was to tap into local folklore and superstition and convince the North Viet Cong forces that they were being haunted by supernatural spirits and the ghosts of former soldiers of the war. The tactic was to scare, intimidate, and use a belief that the Vietnamese had in the afterlife, in the belief that they had if departed soldiers could not be returned home for a proper burial, that their souls would haunt our realm here on Earth for eternity. However, for this plan to work, the U.S. Army would have to generate a tape to be played within earshot of the Viet Cong forces for this to get the desired effect that they wanted. Now, the plan would be to help convince the Viet Cong to abandon their posts altogether by getting them to freak out about the presence of the supernatural. Now, the U.S. Army would spend weeks on developing a convincing enough tape that could dupe the North Vietnamese. They worked within a Saigon-based recording studio and had members of the South Vietnamese forces record over the broadcast to create these convincing quote-unquote characters of soldiers who had been killed in battle. This tape, that would go on to be called Ghost Tape Number 10, would include wails, moans, crying, banging gong sounds, Buddhist funeral music, and even the voices of people saying that they are in hell, and even a young girl crying out for her father. This would be accompanied by some background noise and would be complete and ready for use eventually out in the field. Now, I do want to play you a small snippet of Ghost Tape Number 10 so you have a full understanding of kind of what this tape truly sounded like. It's roughly 30 to 40 seconds long, the little snippet I found for you, and I am going to play it for you right now. Now, the U.S. Army would infiltrate enemy lines and place speakers throughout the woods to mask where these sounds were coming from, and then when night would fall, they would turn the speakers on, in turn making the jungles where the Viet Cong were hiding in filled with the moans and wails coming from these speakers. Now, you might be wondering, did this even work, or did they think that this was a trick from the get-go? And to answer that, there's mixed results. Some uses of the ghost tape number 10 were met with the results of members of the Viet Cong trying to shoot the speakers, and when they would find them, they would shoot the speakers, they would destroy them. However, that was kind of not the best idea because it would reveal the Viet Cong's position within the jungle. However, if they did happen to stumble upon a speaker of these Viet Cong, they would know that the jig is up and that this wasn't really working anymore because they know that the wails and the moans coming from the woods around them were not the souls of their departed friends and former soldiers, but rather just some type of prank that was being played on them by the U.S. military. Now, in one particular instance, when the use of ghost tape number 10 during Operation Wandering Soul, the U.S. Army actually decided to broadcast the tape from helicopters, but that was met with very little success because it just caused the Viet Cong to shoot at the helicopters, and it really didn't have any desired effect at all because they just realized that, hey, this helicopter's going overhead, and it's playing the noises. Let's get rid of the noises by shooting the helicopter. So that part of Operation Wandering Soul really didn't have any intended effect that they had hoped for. Now, perhaps the largest success of the campaign would be when another tape was made and it would be completed with a tiger growl on it that they managed to get a recording of from the Bangkok Zoo in Thailand. Now, at one hillside encampment, this would startle a large battalion of Viet Cong forces and they would abandon post altogether. However, the consensus from what I was able to dig up was that the project was not overall very successful. And many Viet Cong were able to figure out that this was a prank that was being played on them to basically change their perception of what was going on around them. The U.S. Army would come right out and claim that the project was a success with of course, very little examples of the project actually working to support these claims. However, the military is no stranger to Psyop campaigns. The U.S. military has used Psyops as an effective tool to try and sway public opinion throughout the world. Of course, Vietnam was perhaps an example of these tactics. They were used heavily post-Vietnam War during the Cold War to try and spread anti-communism propaganda. And in addition to this, many PSYOP campaigns were attempted on Cuba during this time as an effort to destabilize the country and sway public opinion away from communism. Now, I could do some individual episodes all over some more PSYOP campaigns that were done, especially during kind of the Cold War and kind of the rise of communism during this time, or I guess the big fight against communism during this time. I could do other episodes on other PSYOPs as well that I will probably do here in the future if that is something that you, the viewers, would like me to cover, but it is definitely something I've taken a look at before. However, and overall, PSYOP campaigns, you could add, have seen heightened attention in current times because of conspiracy circles. That is very true. But also currently because of dead internet theory, and in the age where everything has influencers. The idea that public opinion could be swayed from bots, internet trolls, and fake influencers funded by the government is a very much real possibility if it isn't already happening. While Operation Wandering Soul might be one of the more creative examples of a military psyop, especially with them leaning into this belief in the paranormal, the idea of using said belief in the paranormal to help push a narrative against this opposing fighting force is very much a creative idea. However, again, the results were very mixed, and kind of seems like this is the only example we have, or one of the only examples we have, when it comes to something like this, or the U.S. Army leaning into the idea of the paranormal to get an intended result out of a fighting force or out of a population of people. However, it is not the only one, and we do have another example of something like this taking place in the Philippines in the 1950s. However, that is a story for another episode, as that is one that I have looked into extensively, and I'm kind of surprised that I've not covered it yet before, but it is on my list, and I'm certainly going to cover it. Kind of keep that in the back of your mind. I will come back to the whole PSYOP thing eventually, with the U.S. Army, the CIA, in the Philippines in the 1950s. However, overall, like I mentioned, Operation Wandering Soul was kind of a split idea on whether or not it was even successful in the first place. You maybe had a few isolated instances of the Viet Cong believing that these noises were real and that they were the voices of departed friends and family members and soldiers from the war, and that they were not properly taken care of, and now they are haunting this plane of existence for eternity. However, a lot of them kind of didn't fall for this trap and kind of discovered very quickly that this was some type of ruse set up by the Americans to try to get some sort of reaction out of them, and of course, abandon their post or retreat or surrender or something like that. Overall, the project again was met with very limited success. However, it is a very early case of a Psyop campaign of the U.S. Army using in kind of a untraditional way, and that to me was really cool and stood out for me when I wanted to cover it for this week's episode. However, that's not the only topic I want to talk to you about today. Also on today's episode, I want to talk about a separate possible paranormal episode that occurred in 2008. On September 12th, 2008, Charles Peck was traveling to Los Angeles to see his fiancée, Andrea Katz. He worked for Delta Airlines in Salt Lake City, Utah, and he was en route to a job interview at Van Nuys Airport in Los Angeles. This would have been better for Peck, as then he would have been closer to Katz, and this would have allowed them to actually get married, as they were putting off the deed until they had both lived in California. The final leg of the journey that Charles Peck would take was a short train ride through Los Angeles. However, Peck would unknowingly pass away on this train ride that day. The train Peck was on, a Metrolink commuter train, departed Los Angeles for the Moore Park neighborhood at 3:35 p.m. with an arrival time in Moore Park after about a little over an hour. Shortly after leaving the Chatsworth station in Los Angeles, the Metrolink train engineer, Robert Sanchez, would make a fatal mistake. Sanchez would fail to obey a red light signal, indicating a section of rail that was not safe to travel down. This would cause the Metrolink commuter train to enter a section of single rail area in which another train was traveling down. This would cause the commuter train to strike a Union Pacific freight train in a head-on collision. What would occur next would be a catastrophic crash, both trains becoming mostly derailed, and the front of the commuter train would be pushed backwards from the crash, sending it on top of the first passenger compartment of the train. The Metrolink train was carrying 225 passengers, and it would strike the Union Pacific freight train at 83 miles an hour. 25 people would be killed in the crash, and 135 would be injured. All in all, the accident would be described as, and I quote, a bloody, a mess, just a disaster. It was horrible, by a member of the LAFD, and the extent of the injuries to the passengers were gruesome and extensive. Charles Peck would be one of the fatalities in the train accident. However, this is where our story really begins. Andrea Katz would hear about the train accident on the radio as her and her parents were en route to pick Charles up from the train station, and they would continue there and try to figure out what happened. At this point, she did not know that her fiancé had died in the accident at the time. As rescue crews scoured the wreckage, Charles had not been found yet in the wreckage, and his family and loved ones waited hour after agonizing hour, waiting to hear any news about whether or not Charles was alive or dead. Over the following 11 hours after the accident, Charles's loved ones would start to get phone calls from Charles's phone number. These calls were not just local to his fiancée, Andrea, but also to Charles's brother, his son, stepmother, and sister. Whenever anyone would answer these phone calls from Charles, hoping to hear some type of update that he was okay, they were just met with static on the other end of the line. No voice, no sign of Charles being on the phone with them. This would, of course, continue over the course of the night and for the next 11 hours. Charles's family would report these phone calls to the search and rescue teams, and they were able to trace the phone signal to find where Charles was within the train wreckage. Shortly after the calls stopped, roughly an hour to be specific, searchers would discover the body of Charles Peck within the Metrolink train wreckage. However, in the biggest mystery of this, Charles Peck was found to have died immediately upon impact, and that there was no possible way that he could have survived for 11 hours within the wreckage. So this, of course, begs the question, if Charles died upon impact within the train crash, who was the person or thing calling his family while he had passed away? Could this somehow be Charles trying to contact his family right after he had passed and trying to tell them that he did not make it? Now, on the surface, this seems like the most common explanation. However, I want to explore all the possibilities that we do have in regards to this curious case and whether or not it truly was perhaps the ghost of Charles Peck contacting his loved ones from beyond the grave. Now, like I mentioned in the open, we did cover a similar story when it came to something like this in the Jack Rose emails quite a while ago, and I believe it was roughly a season and a half ago. And if any of you happen to listen to that episode, I believe I actually cited on the fact of believing that that was in fact real as opposed to some prank, and I am leaning over towards that direction as well in this case, and let me tell you why. Now, perhaps the most prevalent theory for the phone calls being something explainable is that the medics and first responders, and then medical professionals, got Charles's death wrong, and that he was in fact alive for much longer than they predicted, and he managed to call his family as an effort to try and get help while he was trapped within the train crash. Now, from what I could find in other sources that I checked that reported on this, was that Charles's phone was never recovered from the crash site. They did use it to triangulate his rough location, but by all accounts, no one could find his phone. I also could not find why the medical professionals thought that Charles died on impact, as opposed to surviving out multiple hours afterwards. However, I don't think it is a stretch of the imagination to say that if these medical professionals and the first responders claimed that Charles died on impact, unfortunately, Charles was probably in a pretty bad state when they found his remains. And for that reason, I don't think this could have been Charles still being alive post-accident. Another theory that was proposed is the idea that perhaps somebody working within the recovery effort was playing some type of very sick and crude practical joke and took Charles's phone from the crash site and used it to prank call his family. Now, maybe this is a little far-fetched, but we have to consider it. Now, because of the wide scale of the accident and the mass casualty incident this was, it makes me hard-pressed to think that this was someone like a first responder prank calling his family for 11 hours after the accident. In addition to this, it was recorded that Charles's phone made roughly 35 calls during that 11 hours to his family, which, if this was a prank, that is next level dedication for a prank involving someone who has passed away. This would be disrespectful, crude, and overall, I would have a really hard time believing this because of the implications and because of the circumstances. That, and from what I found online, the phone helped locate Charles within the crash, meaning that his phone must have been in the crash itself and not in someone's pocket or something like that. Now, I don't like this theory, and it's kind of very disrespectful, but of course we have to consider it as it is something that has been proposed as a possible theory. Now, if we want to lean into the idea that this could be something paranormal, it would beg the question of how this worked, because on the surface, you would think that perhaps you would have to dial everyone's number individually or scroll through your contacts list at the time and call them. However, lists could be formatted differently, alphabetized, and the whole 9 yards. This would seem awfully difficult for something paranormal, but again, who knows? Maybe perhaps the ghost of Charles was in his favorites, or maybe used speed dial or something like that. Again, I know that this is 2025, speed dial really isn't a thing anymore, but it definitely used to be, especially in 2008. Smartphones were not a prevalent thing. A lot of people, were walking around with the BlackBerry. Remember when that was popular? A lot of people were walking around with phones like that, and they did have speed dial. So again, like I said, we need to consider that smartphones were not a widely available commodity, and we had no idea, and it was not reported, what type of phone Charles had, so we can't really dive deep down the rabbit hole as to how the phone calls were made. But if this was something paranormal, maybe it uses the speed dial function within Charles's phone already and uses that to make the calls. It would stand to reason that maybe Charles would have, his family within his speed dials, and that's the only thing that was in his speed dials. So it would make sense that his family got the calls in that order, and it wasn't anybody else, and that it wasn't, maybe a coworker or a boss or something like that was called. It was just his family. So maybe if in fact his favorites or his speed dial was just his family, this would maybe make sense. And the spirit of Charles was simply using his speed dial as the quickest and most efficient way to try to get in touch with him and let them know that he had passed away. However, overall, the idea of this being something paranormal seems to be the legit favorite theory, as the other more mundane options we do have do not seem plausible. Now, is it possible that Charles survived within the crash and his phone was damaged, preventing the calls from going through? Yeah, that's very much a possibility again. However, we have to take the information we do have and that is the diagnosis that Charles died upon impact because of his location within the train and the fact that it took 12 hours for first responders to recover his body. Now, you also have the idea of the prankster, which I personally don't believe, and to add another wrinkle to this theory, the prankster, if this was a prankster, would then have to know who to call if they went through the contacts list, and it is no guarantee that all of Charles's family members would have the same last name, and there's no guarantee as well that perhaps all the names could have been in Charles's favorites, or speed dial was just his family as well. I know I just mentioned the whole speed dial thing, but there's a lot of unknowns to this and a lot of information we don't have that I think if we did have, it would give us a lot better understanding of what could be going on here. But unfortunately, like I said, we've never recovered Charles's phone. We don't know what happened to it. We don't really have a whole lot of additional information that maybe could shine some light on some of the unanswered questions we have. So we're kind of left, digging for information or reaching for information as opposed to maybe having a more outlined idea of what the most plausible theory could have been. However, again, there is, like I said, there's no guarantee that if this was a prankster that all the names in his favorites or his speed dial would have been just his family. If this was a prankster, again, they would have to search for names and they'd have to know the names of his family members, and that is very much a stretch, and that doesn't make sense because you don't know people's last names. I mean, me personally, there's at least 3 to 4 different last names in my family alone, and if you scroll through my contacts list, you wouldn't immediately know that they were my direct family members or my direct relatives. You just wouldn't know, especially if a stranger scrolled through my contacts or anything like that. Now, I think you have many, many layers to this event, and that makes me feel like this, of course, was something paranormal in nature and something that isn't conventionally explained. However, there is just so much about this that we don't know, and I feel like because of the severity of the event and the accident itself kind of overshadows this smaller paranormal incident that would take place inside of it. However, again, in my opinion, I do feel like this is something paranormal. However, there's so many unsolved, questions we have about what truly could have gone on here, but it kind of sticks out as, very much a possible case of paranormal contact from beyond the grave. And if that is in fact the case, that is something that is very, very kind of rare within the paranormal field. Obviously, we have multiple different forms of paranormal contact and things like that. However, very rare. I had not heard of anything else maybe like this, where there was paranormal contact through phones and things like that. However, it's a very, very perplexing case, and like I said, there's so many unsolved or unanswered questions, rather, that kind of doesn't allow you to come up with a great theory as to what happened. However, feel free to let me know what your personal theories are when it comes to the Charles Peck phone calls, and whether or not this could have truly been a story about a paranormal being trying to contact their loved ones after they passed. But with that being said, that is going to conclude this week's episode over Operation Wandering Soul and the Charles Peck phone calls. I apologize for not dropping an episode last week. I got sucked up at work. It's a crazy week, and I just neglected to get an episode out last week. However, again, I try to be as consistent as I possibly can, so obviously I'm getting this episode out for you all, and then obviously back to the rhythm, hopefully, for the coming weeks. But with that being said, that is going to do it for this week's episode. Again, if you're listening to this on Spotify and YouTube, please like, comment, subscribe. If you're on YouTube, it helps me out within the algorithm, and I greatly appreciate it. If you're listening to this on Spotify, please turn on post notifications so you get notified every time I post a new episode. Feel free to follow me on TikTok, Instagram. Feel free to send me topic suggestions as well to my email, which is unblurringtheunknown@gmail.com. Do all those things for me. I appreciate the world of it, and I cannot thank you enough. But with that being said, again, that is going to conclude this week's episode, and I will see you all on the next one.